So you're someone who really digs deeper, aren't you? You're not satisfied with just the headlines.
Exactly.
So let's get straight to it. May 8th, 1945. I mean, that's the day Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered in Europe. Seems simple, but
Well, it's anything but simple when you look closer. And to really get a feel for the weight of that moment, we've been looking at this really compelling piece of writing. It reflects on that specific day.
right.
And it gives us this view from the ground,
Yeah.
a really human perspective that goes way beyond just the official announcements of victory.
Exactly. Yeah, forget the ticker tape parades for just a second. Our mission here isn't just to tick off historical facts, is it?
Yeah.
We really want to unpack the complexities of what our source actually calls this day of silence. Because, well, for so many people caught up in it, it wasn't really an end. It was more like a transition.
Into a new reality.
Yeah. Yeah, a new reality, one that was deeply personal and, I mean, often still filled with suffering. Okay, so let's start maybe by stepping into the ruins of Berlin. What does our source tell us about the atmosphere there? What did it feel like?
Oh, the writing paints a truly desolate picture. Just try to imagine Berlin as a wasteland of rubble. That's the phrase used.
Wow.
Buildings that were once grand, now just skeletal facades. And the streets you might have known, maybe strolled down just years before, were choked, completely choked with debris.
Hmm.
This physical devastation, it really brings home the sheer scale of the conflict that had just, engulfed the entire continent.
And what's so striking, I think, is that even with this huge act of surrender, the war hadn't just stopped. Not for everyone in Berlin, anyway.
No, not at all.
It wasn't like flipping a switch and suddenly, poof, everything's peaceful. It was much more gray.
Precisely. And what's quite sobering, actually, in the source material is the mention of child soldiers.
Right.
Boys as young as 14 or 15 still wearing the uniforms of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, on May 8th.
On May 8th. The text really emphasizes that these children, they had no choice. They were still being used as messengers in engineering roles, even operating anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust.
God, it's hard to imagine.
And tragically, some of them were still losing their lives on this very day, the supposed day of peace.
It's almost a paradox, isn't it?
Hmm.
You've got the official surrender sign, but the dying continues. What does that tell us about the gap between the paperwork and the reality on the ground?
It tells us a lot. And speaking of the paperwork, the act of surrender itself, that's a moment just heavy with historical significance.
Absolutely. And where did it happen?
It took place in Berlin-Karlshorst. That was near the Reichstag, the German parliament building.
Okay.
And representing the defeated Wehrmacht, you had Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. He was chief of the high command, so right at the top.
Right.
Along with Colonel General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf from the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg for the Navy.
And on the Allied side, Marshal Georgy Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union, a huge figure, obviously, and Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder represented the Western Allies. He was specifically from the British Royal Air Force.
A truly world-altering moment, just loaded with the weight of years of, well, unimaginable conflict. But as this text sort of subtly points out, there's a tragic undercurrent to this formality as well, isn't there?
There is. And what's fascinating, or perhaps telling, is the clear dominance of the Soviet Union in that specific ceremony in Berlin.
Ah, interesting.
This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a fundamental reshaping of the geopolitical map. And while the prominent role of the Soviets really reflects their immense contribution, and frankly, their immense sacrifice, especially in that brutal final push to capture Berlin.
Right. And while that ink was drying on the surrender documents there in Berlin, the guns hadn't actually fallen silent everywhere across Europe yet, had they?
No, definitely not. The ceasefire wasn't immediate or universal. The source specifically mentions the ongoing and quite fierce fighting in Prague
Prague, right.
between German soldiers and Czech insurgents. That uprising had actually started back on May 5th.
Okay.
And it wasn't fully put down until May 9th, the next day, when Soviet troops finally rolled in and ended it. So yeah, to say the war was completely dead on May 8th, it just isn't accurate.
It really underscores how messy and sort of drawn out the end of a massive conflict like this can be. It's rarely just a clean break, is it?
Not at all.
And the human cost, I mean, we talked about the defeated, but the cost for the victors in all of this was also just immense.
Undeniably. Absolutely staggering. The Red Army paid such a heavy price for taking Berlin. Marshal Zhukov's forces alone suffered over 80,000 casualties.
80,000.
Just in that final battle. And the text then introduces us to this one individual, Iwan K. He's a Red Army soldier, and his story powerfully illustrates this human cost of victory.
What happened to him?
Well, he had already lost his entire family back in the horrific siege of Stalingrad.
Okay.
And then he fought relentlessly, all the way across Russia, Ukraine, Poland, finally reaching Berlin.
His story is just profoundly sad, isn't it? He witnesses this ultimate victory, the symbolic heart of the enemy finally falling.
Mm.
But he's so deeply scarred by everything he's seen and endured that, according to the source, he just never speaks again.
Never speaks again, and suffered from terrible nightmares, screaming in his sleep. It just paints this picture of a victory bought at a terrifying personal price.
It really humanizes the immense trauma, doesn't it? Even for those who were technically on the winning side.
Exactly. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, it forces us to confront that often unseen human cost that underlies, well, any military victory. The psychological wounds are deep, they're enduring.
And the impact on the defeated, equally heartbreaking,
Okay.
really. The source gives us another stark story. Helmut P., I think.
Yeah.
A 13-year-old.
Yeah, Helmut P., imagine being that young, just 13, basically still a child. Part of the Hitler Youth, deployed at a roadblock with a Panzerfaust, one of those handheld anti-tank weapons.
On May 8th.
On May 8th, what was supposed to be the last day of the war. And the text highlights this absolutely horrific moment when his best friend was killed right there, right in front of him. And even though Helmut himself survived the war, that single brutal event, it haunted him for the rest of his life.
It's just a chilling reminder of the lasting psychological damage, isn't it? Inflicted on even the very youngest who got caught up in it, on the losing side.
These individual stories, they really cut through the grand narratives of history. Yes. They force us to confront the human scale of this event beyond the flags and the big declarations.
Which brings us maybe to the figure of Alfred Jodl. He represents something else entirely.
Yes, Jodl. He represents a particularly unyielding figure in this whole moment. As a high-ranking colonel general, chief of operations staff for the OKW, he was deeply implicated, not just in carrying out the war's often cruel orders, but also in, well, justifying them.
Right. His actions left behind this legacy of immense destruction, war crimes. He signed the initial surrender document in Reims, France, on May 7th to the Western Allies.
Correct.
But the Soviets, understandably perhaps, insisted on a second, more formal ceremony, the one in Berlin on May 8th. And his demeanor during this final symbolic act, what does the source reveal about that?
The text emphasizes Jodl confirming the Wehrmacht's final surrender, quote, without remorse, without hope for a better future.
Wow.
Without remorse.
It speaks to this chilling inflexibility, doesn't it? Almost a refusal to acknowledge the utter devastation his side had caused. It really raises questions about the mindset of those who clung so fiercely to it all, right to the bitter end.
And his fate after the war serves as a pretty stark reminder of the consequences of those actions, and perhaps that mindset too.
Indeed. Jodl was later put on trial at Nuremberg, convicted and executed in October 1946 for his very significant role in the war and its atrocities.
Right.
And the source directly links his demise to his pride and inflexibility, suggesting this fundamental inability maybe to confront the enormity of the catastrophe he'd helped orchestrate. So May 8th, 1945. Undeniably, it marks the end of a war that consumed millions upon millions of lives. But as we've really seen through the lens of our source material today, it was anything but a straightforward, happy ending for so many people.
No. For the survivors, the soldiers like I-1K who would never truly return home, the children like Helmut P. forced into these adult roles far too soon. May 8th often marked not an end, but actually the beginning of a new chapter of suffering. The physical wounds might eventually heal, maybe. But the invisible wounds, the pain, the trauma, the psychological scars, they were often just beginning to take their lasting hold. The war had irrevocably shaped their lives in ways we can perhaps only begin to comprehend.
So I think the crucial understanding here, the takeaway, is that May 8th, 1945 was just a profoundly complex day, multifaceted.
Absolutely.
It's the end of a horrific conflict on paper, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
But it was also a day deeply imbued with enduring suffering for countless individuals, really on all sides of that conflict. It was a moment far more nuanced, far more human than just a simple declaration of peace.
And this brings us to, I think, a really vital point for you, the listener, to consider. How does focusing on these individual experiences, the ones that often get left out of the main story, experiences of those on all sides, victors and defeated, adults and children, how does digging into that shift or maybe deepen your perception of major historical turning points like the end of the Second World War?
It certainly compels us, I think, to look beyond just the broad strokes of history, to consider the incredibly personal, the incredibly lasting impact of these huge events.
Hmm.
So we'd really encourage you to reflect on that, the long-term consequences of war, those enduring ripples of trauma and loss that just continue to spread long, long after the last shot is fired.